Good morning and welcome everyone. So for those of you who are watching the video, I'm Dr. John Saunders from the Communication Arts Department here at UAH. And this is another speaker in my series of speakers in my class, my Communication 340 class, Public Memory and Race in the South. And today we have Dr. John Mohr, who's a lecturer in the Department of History, and he's going to be discussing transportation museums and monuments and how they intersect with African American history and the civil rights movement. So with that, Dr. Mohr, I will turn it over to you.
Hey everybody, really glad to be with you this morning. This is kind of something that intersects with a couple of my different interests. So my background is actually in the history of technology. I kind of study the auto industry most primarily, but I've also studied race in transportation, class in transportation. My main interest is in the auto industry and kind of how that relates to sort of the development of the South. But I've long had an interest in kind of how civil rights in the U.S. sort of interact with our transportation networks, because being the very large and sort of far-flung nation that we are, we've always had lots of transportation sort of systems, networks to get from, point A to point B. And it's very interesting to me kind of how that sort of intersects with our sort of racial history, history of ethnic conflict, history of class conflict. So I've kind of tried to understand, how this sort of came about. And nowadays, it's really interesting because we've chosen to memorialize a lot of aspects of the civil rights movement of the 1950s, as well as earlier, 1950s and 60s, as well as earlier, in the form of these transit-related monuments, cultural artifacts, memorials, museums. And there's a lot of examples of these, that we've used. And I think that if we look at them kind of critically, we can sort of understand a little bit more about perhaps how public memory functions in our society. What are some of the issues, the problems associated with that? What are some ways that maybe we can improve on it? Because one of the really interesting things to me is how, in looking at some of these memorials, you can see some of the issues of like inequality that still exists in our society today, and kind of in terms of how this has come about. So I'll try to give you some examples of exactly what it is that I mean. But I figured, trying to focus on Alabama specifically a little bit, hopefully that'll be something that at least some of you are familiar with. So let's see here. Can I do screen share? Should be able to.
Yes.
All right, let me see. Share screen for, boom. How's that, guys? Looks good. Alrighty, excellent. Let me put my presentation on. There we go, nice. All right. So what am I talking about? Okay. Maybe the most famous sort of transit related flashpoint of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. Okay. Bet you all probably know who that is in the front there. Anybody tell me?
It's Rosa Parks.
Oh yes, yep, Miss Rosa Parks, right? Miss Rosa Parks kicked off the Montgomery bus boycott, one of the kind of earliest sort of beginnings of the post-war sort of civil rights movement, broadly construed. She famously got on the segregated bus, sat in the whites only section, would not give up her seat. And this was sort of used as a test case to try and force the integration of these buses and sort of end the segregation of them. So something to clarify, within Montgomery, these buses were used by both white and black citizens. So they were segregated. They had a black seating section, a white seating section. And the rule was, if you were black and all the seats in the bus were occupied, you had to stand. If a white person came in, you had to give up your seat. All right. So it was very kind of demeaning in that way. And there were lots of flashpoints of racial conflict that happened on these buses between the drivers and passengers, between the passengers themselves. People were kicked off the buses. They had their money stolen. There was actually a historian that kind of went back through and looked at all of these, instances of conflict that were recorded by the Montgomery police, as well as the bus company itself. But again, this was about kind of the control of space, who gets to occupy what space and on what terms. And that was why it was so important to a lot of these activists, because they wanted to, essentially democratize that space, make it available on the same terms to all people. Because at the time, this was how the majority of working class people, black and white, had to get to their jobs. A lot of people didn't own cars. A lot of people couldn't afford them, couldn't afford parking, whatever it might be. Rosa Parks was a seamstress. She worked at a department store in downtown Montgomery. So she rode the bus every day, as did a lot of other, African Americans that worked service jobs, other jobs in downtown Montgomery. So, right away we can see what the importance of this was. It wasn't just something that was, a mere inconvenience. This was people's livelihoods, right? And so this really mattered, deeply to a lot of people, and was one of the reasons why this had, such an echo sort of into the future. So shifting gears a little bit, okay, before we kind of delve further into the Rosa Parks story, we've got to talk about this museum, okay, the Henry Ford in Dearborn, Michigan. Has anybody ever been here? Doesn't look like it. Okay. If you do get the chance, it is absolutely worth it to go. All right. It is one of the kind of best sort of public museums in the United States. Yes, I am very biased because I like cars a lot, but the one of the amazing things and kind of dreadful things about this place is that, especially in the early years of the institution, they were able to accumulate a lot of priceless sort of artifacts of American history. And some of these they kind of came by through their association with the Ford Motor Company. Others they sort of came by because Henry Ford could kind of get whatever he wanted when he was sort of still alive. So, what do I mean by that? Okay. This is just some examples of some of the things you can find at the Henry Ford Museum. The very first Ford Mustang that was ever created, that's the top, I think it would be the right on your screen, right, or top left, the white car on the screen. The very first Ford Mustang that was ever created, okay, well, Ford Motor Company made that, so not too surprising it's at the Henry Ford Museum. The car that JFK was assassinated in, that's over there on the right with the mannequin of JFK and his wife, Jackie. They wound up with a lot of the presidential limos. Kind of strange considering that this is a private, museum. It's sort of operated by a private entity, and these were sort of presidential vehicles, but okay. The first Honda Accord ever made in the United States, 1982, Honda's first factory in Ohio, they wound up with that car, right? So even though this was this Japanese car made in America, it kind of shows you the overwhelming influence of this institution, that they were the ones that wound up with it. But kind of the best example of what I'm talking about is that building right there. Okay. That is the Wright Brothers bicycle shop, right? It is the bicycle shop. It is not a recreation. They bought this from Dayton, Ohio, and moved it to the part of the museum grounds called Greenfield Village. Why was it called Greenfield Village? Because Henry Ford's idea was basically that they cleared this piece of land and he was going to pick up all of these really important buildings, transport them from wherever their original locations were, and put them, in this sort of model toy village that he had created. He was sort of all about like, well, I want to preserve all of this Americana that seems to be disappearing because of my invention, the Model T. You know, America's changing rapidly. So his buddy Harvey Firestone of Firestone Tires, he bought the house that he grew up in and put it in Greenfield Village. And so if you go visit Greenfield Village today, you can walk into that house and it's people reenacting a 19th century farmhouse with no electricity. And it's the actual house. They put it on the back of a truck and moved it from, I think, upstate New York into this place in Dearborn, Michigan. This is where this is at. It's sort of just outside of Detroit, basically. And they did this with all kinds of other buildings. Most of them are not as quite as distinguished as the Wright Brothers Bicycle Shop. Well, and I should clarify, do you guys know the Wright Brothers claim to fame? Somebody say it for those that don't know, maybe.
Well, the airplane.
The airplane, right? Okay, the first sort of heavier than air, you know, practical working airplane, right? So these priceless pieces of heritage were effectively taken out of the communities where they were originally, you know, created, where they were originally situated, and put in this private museum, right? This kept happening until Henry Ford actually tried to buy Constitution Hall in Philadelphia, where the Constitution was written, pack it up and move it to Greenfield Village. And that was finally an outcry that was big enough to stop this from happening. And it led to Constitution Hall being restored. And, you know, it's a pride of place in Philadelphia today. But there were a lot of other things that were sort of taken away. And this kind of reflected sort of the thinking about historic preservation at the time, which was not a whole lot of thinking. Really, like a lot of things were either not preserved or they were sort of taken out of their original situations and, you know, put in sort of other contexts. So, you know, this is a very big and powerful institution still to its day. It has an annual operating budget of $73 million, right? That is enormous by sort of the standards of institutions of this type. There are very few museums that have budgets that are anywhere close to that. You're probably talking about like the Smithsonian, maybe the Met in New York, right? They have a huge endowment. They got over $10 million in donations, just donations in 2019 alone, right? So this is a very big and powerful institution. And, you know, in some ways it's good that we have institutions that have this much clout, right? Because they have the deep pockets to preserve history. And the Henry Ford is an amazing place to visit. You know, there's very few places that you can visit that have this level of, you know, stuff on display. But it is a privately operated institution, right? And it's not cheap to get in. And the $25 admission cost is just for the main museum. There's sort of the Henry Ford Museum, which itself is quite large. But then if you want to get into Greenfield Village, it's another $25. If you want to see some of their other attractions, it's more money. So it's almost comparable to like a day pass at Disney if you want to see everything that they've got, right? And you do get a lot for your money, but I think you can probably see that for, you know, the average person, this is a pretty big chunk of change, right? Especially if you're poor, working class, you know, you're not going to be able to get in here on, at least not on a regular basis, right? You can buy a membership to the museum, but that's, you know, even more expensive. So just giving you a sense that the Henry Ford is one of the big heavy hitters in sort of American museums, American historical institutions, and they tend to get their way when they want certain things, right? So how does this relate to Rosa Parks, right? Why am I talking about this if we're talking about Rosa Parks? Okay. What happened to Rosa Parks' bus, right? Well, it might surprise you to learn that after the very famous incident, they kept using it, right? The bus company in Montgomery, after the boycott was over, It was a 1948 GMC. This is it that you're looking at right now. And they just kept using it probably until the early 1970s, until it was retired. And then they sold it at auction, just sold it off probably for nominal amount of money. And this guy in Montgomery, private citizen, just bought it and put it in a field, and he used it to store tools in, right? Okay. He put tools in it. There might have been chickens living in it at one point in time. And it was just, nobody really thought much of it, right? The guy who originally bought it, he thought it might have been the Rosa Parks bus. He didn't have documentation because nobody recorded like the serial number on the bus. Nobody kind of recorded that when the sort of Rosa Parks incident occurred. Luckily, researchers from the Henry Ford, when they found out about this thing, that it was sitting in a field outside Montgomery, they were able to track down enough documentation from the guy who was the manager of the bus depot to pretty conclusively prove that this was the bus, right? So there was finally sort of this proof that, oh man, it's this thing. And it had been sitting in this field outside Montgomery for, going on 30, 40 years. So the guy who originally bought it passed away, and his children inherited it. And his son realized what the importance of this thing might be. And he contacted an auction house to effectively give him an idea of what it might be worth. That's when people in the museum world, people in the civil rights world started to take interest, because it was sort of assumed that this thing was gone. Nobody really knew what had happened to it. And then the announcement was made that this thing was going to go up for sale in 2001. Rosa Parks was still alive at that point. She passed away in 2005. She wasn't involved kind of in the auction of this, but she was aware of it. So research was done on this thing. A lot of people felt confident that this was the real deal, and it just sort of went up for auction. And nobody really knew what this thing was going to sell for. It started at the bidding starting at $50,000, and it sold for $492,000. Right. This is in 2001. So I mean, that's, the inflation hasn't been crazy since then, but it is probably like $600,000, $700,000 equivalent today. And the Henry Ford outbid the Smithsonian and numerous other institutions, including the city of Denver. They wanted to put it in sort of the Colorado Women's Museum, which is a famous sort of women's museum. There were civil rights groups in Montgomery. There were people in Montgomery who talked about, buying this bus and bringing it back to, a point of pride in Montgomery. But nobody had the deep pockets like the Henry Ford did. The bidding on this thing went on for like 10 hours. It went until like 2 a.m, and the next day. And the Henry Ford just, they just put money down. They just put money down. So they got this thing. And I mean, it was a wreck, right? Because it had just been sitting in this field for years and years and years. And they wanted to restore it, right? They didn't want to just leave it like that. They wanted to restore it, which was going to be, again, a lot of money, over $300,000 when all was said and done, right? So they sunk almost as much money into this thing as they put down to buy it, right? But it wasn't all their money, right? Because the federal government gave them $205,000, right? So here's something to know. If you want to go into the humanities, if you want to go into the museum world, okay, the world of writing for, getting, and making grants is unfortunately about as unequal as the rest of our society. All right. The bigger a name that you have, the bigger a name institution that you have, the better opportunities that you typically have to win grants, get grants, to do big things with, right? And in the humanities, getting grants is how you do stuff, really, like how you pull off projects like this, how you go on trips, how you buy things from museums, right? You either have a really deep pocketed donor to support you, or you're really good at getting grants from foundations or the federal government. The federal government gives out a lot of grants, states give out a lot of grants. But, you know, part of it is they just want to know that their money is going to be spent well. And if you're a big institution with a long track record of pulling off projects like this, then, you know, you're going to be up there. But the downside of that is that smaller time people with less established track records, maybe like community organizations, things like that, tend not to be, you know, on the receiving end as much, right? For stuff of this caliber, at least, you know, still possible to get grants, but it's going to be kind of on a smaller level, right? So it's kind of one of those situations where you got to have money to get money, right? Got to have money to make money. So Henry Ford wound up with this thing, all right? Spent years restoring it, all right? And this is what it looks like now. I've been there, I've seen it, I've sat in it, did a really beautiful job with this thing, right? And it's in a very nice facility. It'll be well protected. It'll be well preserved. They've probably got a curator whose job is just to look after the Rosa Parks bus, this sort of priceless, you know, national treasure. But it is now effectively in the hands of a private foundation. You've got to pay $25 to see it if you want to see it. And it's not going back to Montgomery, right? It's not going back to Montgomery. The city of Montgomery, civil rights groups in Montgomery have kind of talked about this. And in the Montgomery Civil Rights Museum, there's a replica of it that actually has a statue. I was going to throw a picture of that in here, but I forgot to slide that into my presentation. There's a nice replica of it, but you know, it's not the real deal. So you can kind of see how this piece of civil rights history, this piece of working class history, has somehow been gentrified effectively throughout this whole process. And in the end of the day, it's wound up in this very fancy museum with an overwhelmingly upper middle class white clientele, right? People like me, effectively. We're most of the ones that go to the Henry Ford Museum, right? The upshot is this piece of priceless culture has been restored. It's been maintained, right? It's going to be in good hands, but you know, at what sort of broader social cost? And this kind of gets to this question, right? You know, who owns history? This is President Obama. You know, he visited the Henry Ford, sat in the Rosa Parks bus, talked about what a moving experience, you know, it was for him. So this obviously still means a lot to a lot of people, and it's great that people can interact with it, right? But you know, this very raw, this sort of very emotional piece of history, I do think that it is kind of a shame that it's been taken so far away from the original context, from the community in which it happened, from the people that made it happen, right? And your average citizen from Montgomery is never ever going to see this thing. They're going to have to settle for a replica. So, you know, it's really something to chew over, right? And you know, this is by no means an isolated, you know, example of this. I mean, the whole debate over the British Museum and all the stuff that they own, right? The Elgin marbles that were famously chiseled off the Parthenon and sort of spirited away during the, you know, time of the British Empire, right? You know, Greeks would really like to have those back. The British are not about to give those up, you know. So there's a lot of stuff in US museums that are like that too. But even within America, there's still, you know, this conflict that's present. All right, more about buses. Okay, interpretation. Right, bus was the way to get around the Freedom Riders. All right, so there was a Supreme Court decision in the late 1950s that effectively said segregation on interstate transportation is illegal, right? states can, at that time, they were like, states could still mandate segregation potentially on, sort of transportation networks within the state, but between the states, Alabama couldn't enforce segregation that sort of crossed state lines, right? That was sort of a overextension of their powers. So there was a Supreme Court ruling, but most of the bus companies continued to abide by sort of the local standards. So in the early 1960s, most like Greyhound stations, Trailways, that was another big bus company at the time, their stations in places like Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi were still segregated. They had white waiting rooms, colored waiting rooms, segregated bathrooms, the whole 9 yards, right? So the whole idea with the Freedom Riders is they would get on the bus in a non-segregated state like New York or Maryland, or someplace that had desegregated its transportation network. And then they would ride into the South and test effectively the Supreme Court ruling. They would effectively try to force the issue of integration. So the guy with the mugshot down there, he's also holding the banner. Dr. James Farmer from the University of Mary Washington in Maryland, he kind of organized a lot of these rides, okay, these freedom rides, as they were called. And he was kind of the orchestrator of this. So this is a, kind of an integral part of this whole struggle over, who gets to control transportation, right? So what happened in Alabama? Okay, Anniston, Alabama, May 14th, 1961. The most kind of infamous incident associated with the Freedom Rides. And so a lot of Freedom Riders were beaten, they were harassed, right? But the Anniston incident was the most infamous, largely because of this photo, right? And this was something that really hung over the heads of people in Anniston for a very long time. And it's still something that kind of evokes powerful emotions, especially in Anniston. But what happened was the Freedom Riders came to Anniston. They were attacked at the bus station. The bus was beaten up. The tires were slashed by this sort of angry mob led by the KKK. The bus driver decided, hey, we just got to get out of here. Even though one of the tires was flat, he basically gunned it out of there with the people that were still in the bus. But the tire was flat. He didn't get very far outside of town, right? And then he had to pull over. Said, I got to change this tire. Well, effectively, the mob caught up with him and they bombed the bus, right? Basically, they threw like a gasoline bomb through the window. Everybody had to run out. When they ran out, they got beaten. Some people got hurt very badly, had to be taken eventually to Birmingham for treatment. And this sort of iconic photo, and there was a whole series of photos. There was a AP press photographer that was there that took these photos. And actually, there's an Antiques Roadshow clip with the son of the guy that took these photos. He still has the negatives, and he talked about how this affected his dad. I have to try and find that. I'll send that to Dr. Saunders if I find it, because it's a really, really touching sort of thing. So very infamous incident, right? And this was in all the newspapers. This photo was all across the US, and it was really shocking to a lot of people that something like this would happen as a result of the freedom rides, right? So for the longest time, this was not something that people in Anniston wanted to remember, right? This was not something that people wanted to memorialize. It was like, let's forget about this. This is an ugly mark on our community. It's a terrible, part of our history. And so, there really wasn't anything for decades effectively on this site. So this photograph that's being held up, the stop for the bus was in an alleyway. The Greyhound station is on the left there. It's that orange building. That's what used to be the Greyhound station. The right is just another building, and the buses would pull into the alleyway. And that was where the first sort of attack happened, when the bus pulled into the alleyway. And see kind of people standing around it. on both sides of this bus, right? So these buildings were kind of just neglected. Eventually, the Greyhound station moved out of that orange building, so it was just vacant, right? And so that was the way that it was for many years, right? So over time, they started to add some more things to this alleyway to memorialize it, kind of as the harshness and the memory faded, right? They were allowed to, or the city sort of made more efforts to try and commemorate this, and the Freedom Riders themselves were sort of instrumental in preserving the memory, of this place, right? So in the 2010s, the surviving Freedom Riders and their advocates were really pushing for President Obama to declare this as a national monument, right? Okay, to declare this as a national monument. And ultimately, it actually happened under President Trump's administration. It was 2017 when the gonna forget the name of it, the National Historic Commission. I think that's who decides what a national monument, what gets to be declared a national monument. So they eventually declared this to be a national monument. So it was put sort of under the protection of the Park Service, and it's considered to be an interpretive site, right? So now we've got this mural of the bus and these photographs, right? And sort of little interpretive panels. So you can kind of go in this alleyway and they've just got these sort of interpretive panels that are on the sides of this alleyway, right? And that's a better photo of the bus mural, right? And they've got, pictures of the bus on fire. They've got the famous photo, the other photos that were taken of the incident that day. But, the broader sort of visual impact of this is just the bus, right? And it asks you, could you get on the bus, right? Could you get on the bus? Could you put yourself in these people's shoes, right? Which I think is definitely kind of a powerful way to interpret this incident. But, the immediate visual impact of this is not too extreme, right? It's just sort of a illustration of the bus itself, right? And then you can kind of look closely at the pictures, and that shows you kind of the magnitude of the whole incident, right? But then, yeah, and so that's just the building. So the building is just occupied by a private business, right? It hasn't been turned into a museum. It hasn't been, directly sort of preserved. I think now that it's part of this national monument, they can't tear it down, or modify it in such a way as to make it unrecognizable. But they're still just, operating a private business out of it effectively. So there's been a push to turn it into a museum, but a lot of people in Anniston seem to be kind of hesitant to that. The mayor doesn't necessarily seem to be on board with that. So that might have changed in recent times, but I'm not that I am aware of. The incident where the bus itself was actually burned by the side of the highway, they just have this marker sign effectively, and that's not even the actual spot. It's a little bit further up there, kind of in that grass field. But they have put a historic marker there so you can stop and read the marker. And this is what the marker says when you sort of look closely at it. Just kind of giving a sort of general, summary of what happened there. So again, it's kind of a very light sort of touch, interpretive approach to this site. If you go to the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, the way that they've chosen to interpret this is much more visually striking, right? That's not the actual bus, just to clarify. It's just a Greyhound bus that looks, pretty much similar to the one that would have been driven that day, but they kind of, altered it to look like it was burned out, right? And so you go into this room and there's like half of this burned out bus, and they've got the pictures sort of blown up, to be really big. They've got John F. Kennedy, that's him kind of on the left side, in his office responding to this. This was one of the sort of main early civil rights crises of JFK's presidency. So it was something that, he was really preoccupied with for a period of time. So, they've chosen to like really, make this sort of a dramatic kind of interpretation. And I think it's interesting that the original site is not as dramatized, but if you go to this museum at the Lorraine Motel, which of course was where uh, MLK was assassinated, they've got this sort of much stronger, approach to interpreting that incident. Another shot of the bus, it kind of dominates sort of the whole room. Um, I don't know that there's any plans to have a replica bus in Anniston or anything like that, but that's, the approach that's been taken here. If you go to the University of Mary Washington, where James Farmer taught, they have a bus that's sort of set up, and they've got pictures sort of in the windows, and it's just kind of functioning as a memorial. But they actually hold events in front of this bus using it as a backdrop. They've held like, speakers on civil rights, historians. They've had commencement for African American students in front of this. So it really gets kind of integrated into a lot of other events, not just sort of being out there as a monument all by itself, but kind of getting integrated into other events as well. Oh, not yet. So I guess my point in bringing this up is when you have an incident that still has very strong, negative memories for a community, there's a couple of different things that you have to balance. You have to balance being true and honest to the reality of that incident, the people that participated in it, sort of what it means to those people. And you have to balance the reality that people that live in that community that just have their normal lives on a day-to-day basis are not going to want their community to be remembered just for that incident, right? They're going to want it to be a place that feels inviting. They're going to want it to be a place that businesses want to set up in, that people want to just have a normal sort of everyday routine kind of in. And this can clash sort of with the idea that we need to memorialize these tragic incidences that have happened in the past, and communicate those lessons to future generations. And I'm not trying to say that Anniston is deliberately suppressing the memory of this thing. I mean, certainly at this point, everybody sort of acknowledges the truth of what happened with that incident. But you can kind of clearly see that there's sort of a decision made to kind of have a light interpretive approach, whereas maybe other places that are more directly focused on sort of the civil rights struggle have made sort of a more dramatic approach to showing the reality of this incident. So it's just one of those examples where the desire to communicate history rubs up against other priorities that you're always going to find in some of these communities. And it also brings up kind of the sort of moral or ethical questions about so-called civil rights tourism, right? Civil rights tourism, people going to visit the sites where these things happen, people going to visit, even places where horrible tragedies happen, even, worse than, a bus getting burned and people getting beat up and people getting killed, people getting shot. Is there something, off about that? Are people making money off of this memory? Are they commodifying it? Is there something, almost morbid about turning civil rights tragedies into in some ways a product that can be sold, right? And most of these places are being operated for the benefit of the people that live there, but it kind of brings up some of these uncomfortable questions about, what is an appropriate sort of use of that memory, right? What is sort of an appropriate testament to the people that actually lived through it and that sort of lived through that struggle. Right? So one more thing, kind of on that sort of uh, theme, right? This movie, right? Did anybody see this movie? Dr. Saunders did. Dr. Saunders, what did you think of this movie?
It's been a while since I've seen it, but it validated a lot of stories that I've heard, growing up in the South, especially growing up in Memphis. And since I've lived in Arkansas, Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia, a lot of the stories that I've heard, it seemed to validate those.
Yeah, yeah, and so prior to kind of the civil rights era, the end of segregation, pretty much the early 70s, prior to that whole era, there was something called the Negro Motor Screen Book, right? And effectively, this was a guide for African American drivers who were going through places where segregation was common. And it needs to be pointed out, this is not effectively referred to the South, right? Just the South. This was also true in a lot of northern states, western states. There were lots of establishments that did not serve African Americans, hotels, restaurants, right? De facto segregation, as it was called. It was not legally mandated in a lot of places, but a lot of establishments observed this, right? And they would refuse you service if you were African American. So, in the days before Google Maps, it was really important to know that you could go somewhere and people would serve you, right? You would have a place to stay, that you would have a place to eat, right? And this famous green book, these were guides, effectively travel guides for Black motorists who are, going on car journeys, right, across the U.S. And so it was very, useful. And you can see kind of the list of all these different establishments that were known to serve African Americans: hotels, taverns, garages, nightclubs, restaurants, service stations. You don't want to be stuck in a place that will not pump gas for you, right? That would be pretty bad. Automotive, need your car fixed, right? And a lot of these establishments were owned by African Americans or operated by African Americans, at least, right? Or at least they would serve people on a segregated basis, right? So better than, I guess, no service at all if you're in a pinch. But this was effectively an essential piece of literature. So this movie, which came out in 2018, Green Book, which was inspired by the relationship between these two guys, Tony Lip. I forget his actual last name. It's something Italian that's very hard for me to pronounce, but he was the white gentleman there who was originally from the Bronx, right? And Don Shirley, the African American, who was at the time one of America's foremost classically trained pianists. He was a great piano player, made lots of recordings, did lots of concerts. He was very in demand, like even among white audiences. People would pay to see this guy. They had him in their homes. And so in 1962, he undertook a tour on through parts of the South and the Eastern Seaboard, right? And he needed a driver, right? He needed a driver. He needed somebody who would kind of be able to take him around. And so he wound up hiring this guy that was recommended to him, who could be, his driver, right? And kind of the way that the movie sort of portrays this is that they became great friends. Tony Lip bailed out Don Shirley in more than one occasion. The way that Don Shirley is sort of portrayed is that, yes, he's this Black man, but he's very well educated. He went to the best schools of music. He did not spend a lot of time around other Black people. He spent more time around, white people. He didn't really know what it was like to deal with segregation because he was part of that rarefied tier of African Americans who, could effectively skirt that system because they were kind of, accepted in white society. That's the way that the movie chooses to portray this. And they kind of set it up as like a buddy comedy, right? They really kind of set this up as, these guys didn't really trust each other at first. They become great friends. There's a scene where Tony Lip teaches Don Shirley how to eat fried chicken, right? There's the like Don Shirley did not eat fried chicken because, that was not something that well-educated, polite people would eat, right? And the screenplay was written largely by one of Tony Lip's sons, who became a screenwriter, right? And he really wanted to tell this story, and he thought it was a very, humane story, right? And people really liked this movie. It wasn't universally, the critics weren't, universal in their praise for it, but Roger Ebert thought it was really good. He was really famous, film critic who was still alive at that time. Um, People won Golden Globes for this. Mahershala, I'm gonna butcher his name, I'm sorry. Mahershala Ali, the guy who played Don Shirley, won a Golden Globe for this, right? Viggo Mortensen got a lot of praise for his performance in this. And this movie did very well in the theaters. Lots of people liked it. It told a story, without being, corny effectively, that a lot of people, want to hear, right? About essentially people from two different backgrounds coming together, getting along, people sort of learning how to live with one another. And, it's really sort of positive, story, right? But there was a problem, right? It turns out that Don Shirley's brother, Don Shirley had passed away, before this movie was made. So it was made, without any of his input, number one. His brother and his family were still alive, and they were not consulted about any aspect of this movie, right? And they really objected to the way that Don Shirley was portrayed as sort of being out of touch with other African Americans in particular, and also the notion that the Tony Lip character was kind of the one that was, saving his skin in some instances, right? So they're driving through the South, and Don Shirley doesn't know what it's like to interact with a segregated society. He doesn't know what it's like to face racism, right? And there was some backlash to that. It still was a movie that a lot of people liked, but Mahershala Ali actually apologized to Don Shirley's family, and they said they really appreciated that, because he hadn't consulted with them, he hadn't worked with them. So, why do I so why am I bringing this up? I mean, it's not about monuments, right, per se, but it is about kind of transportation, and I just think it shows the importance of bringing in the people who really directly sort of interacted with this, right? You want to have more than one perspective when you're trying to do something like this. And it was really kind of a mistake by the director to not consult with Don Shirley's family and create this portrayal of him that, at least in their sense, was not an accurate representation of the kind of person that he was, right? It's great that Tony Lip's son, was involved with this and got his perspective on it. But you've always got to have those kinds of perspectives, especially when you're dealing with something that is, a touchy subject. I mean, let's face it, it's just not an easy thing for people to talk about necessarily. Okay. We got plenty of time for questions, input, discussion, right? So let me think, what's a good way to start this off? were any of you guys aware of anything about the like the Rosa Parks bus and not being in Montgomery? All right, I'll just quit out of screen share.
Our last speaker, she was the curator, someone from the Rosa Parks Museum, and she showed us the replica bus that they had there, um, of the Rosa Parks bus. And so I thought it was interesting that you showed us the actual bus and the story behind the actual bus and everything, because it kind of expanded on what we touched on Monday.
Yeah, that's well good. I'm really glad that you were able to talk to her. I'm sure that she knows about the broader story, of how that came to be. But yeah, I hope I was able to add a little bit more context, I guess, to how that came about. Any other questions, comments?
One question that I have, this is the first time we've discussed a privately owned museum. I mean, technically, the Rosa Parks Museum at Troy University is owned by Troy University, but still, it's a public. Is there a, well, we've also talked about how those in power are the ones that write the narratives. Is there, from what you've seen, a difference in the type of narratives you get at a private museum versus a public museum?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say you're not going to see a lot of stuff about the Ford Pinto at the Henry Ford Museum, right? For those of you that don't know, the Ford Pinto was a little compact car that was, well, it was very popular. I think probably when Dr. Saunders was kind of in high school, college, and learning how to drive. There's probably a lot of Pintos on the road back when, but it was a car that was made with a defect in it so that it would explode when people rear-ended them. And Ford Motor Company really, they took a lot of flack for that. But yeah, to answer the question on a more serious level, if you go to the Henry Ford, you are not going to get a lot of narratives about some of the downsides to technology, to the motor car, to the automobile, to these things that have negative consequences like pollution, like you know uh, uh, degradation of the environment, so on and so forth, urban, suburban sprawl, whatever you want to say, because the narrative of the Henry Ford in particular is very, very anchored in the ideology of progress. I mean, they call it. There's a part of the museum that's like the Museum of American Innovation, and innovation and progress. And yes, and have in this class, have you ever talked about the notion of Whig history? WHIG, not WIG, but WHIG. So the Whigs were this old political party. There were American Whigs and there were British Whigs, but the Whigs sort of had this notion that humanity is always progressing and we're always getting better. Things are getting better all the time, and we should always try to be, striving to get better. So Whig history is kind of the notion that history is just one unbroken, sort of line of progress, right? To, into the future, right? And there's a lot of problems with that, right? Because even when you have something that seems like a really progressive, invention like the car, right? That's pretty cool, right? We're all pretty attached to our cars. I certainly am. But now we have climate change, right? Which, I'm not a climatologist, but if it gets really bad, potentially none of us will be able to breathe the air anymore. That seems pretty bad, right? Um, but just even on a smaller level, there's no acknowledgement there that there's always downsides to technological innovation. There's always downsides to economic growth, right? And I think that when you're in a situation where, no, the Henry Ford is not directly funded by the Ford Motor Company, but it's got Ford's name on the building, right? You're not going to get a lot of counter narratives about some of the downsides that could be associated with those products, right? And when you go to World of Coke in Atlanta, they're not going to tell you that, you know, consuming sugar, lots of sugar, is not good for you, right? Or, you know, that Coca-Cola itself, you know, has got this sort of direct link to diseases like diabetes, right? You know, you're gonna have a lot of nice history about the history of the Coca-Cola company, but you're not gonna get sort of a narrative about, you know, the downside of those products. So I think that there's definitely going to be instances where you're not going to get the kind of critical perspective that you might get at an institution that is operated more in the public interest.
Well, and we talked about that specifically with the idea of trauma. So the EJI Memorial and the Legacy Museum that you and I have both been to in Montgomery, I mean, those are memory sites purely based on trauma. And so they present narratives in certain ways that other museums, especially older museums, have had a more, for lack of a better term, whitewashed history. That's a safer history. I mean, when we had the executive director of Stax Museum, he talked about how one of the things they want to do with the museum is talk about some of the realities of what was happening in Memphis when Stax was recording. And it wasn't this pure utopia within the Stax studio. There were still racial issues that were there, even though you had Black artists and white artists creating music together. Still, as soon as they left the building, they had to go separate ways and couldn't eat together in most places and things like that. So this idea of trauma is, I think, a very big indicator, or it's at least something that's very noticeable. Like what you were talking about with the Ford Museum, you're not going to see trauma there.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. You know, uh, you know, at the Ford Motor Company, so the United Auto Workers eventually unionized General Motors, the Chrysler Corporation, and the Ford Motor Company, the big three of American automaking at the time, the 1930s. And the Ford Motor Company was the last holdout because Henry Ford, especially towards the end of his life, was violently opposed to having a unionized workforce. And when I say violently, I mean literally violently, in that he sent thugs out to have Walter Reuther, Richard Frankenstein, and a couple of the other organizers like beaten up. And there were photos that were taken of this, which are sort of very iconic photos. I could be wrong, but I don't remember seeing anything like that, you know, at the Henry Ford, right? They'll show you pictures of Buckminster Fuller's inventions. They've got all these great steam engines. They've got the first Mustang. They're not going to show you, you know, the grittier side, I guess, is a good way to put it.
Well, do you think this is more about them protecting their interest, or is it possibly about the types of audiences that they're hoping to draw to that museum? Because we've also talked about that and what curators and executive directors do. They have to think about what demographics do we want coming to our museum and how can we attract those demographics.
Yeah. Did you guys talk about the big dust up with the Indianapolis Museum of Art that just happened like a
Mm,
month ago? The the guy, and hopefully I won't fudge any of the details here, but the guy who they hired to be sort of the executive director of the entire museum grounds. The Indianapolis Museum of Art is really nice, and it's on this campus. It's like 40 or 50 acres or something like that, and they've got all these exhibits and things. And they hired this guy to kind of be the director of the art museum there and the whole campus grounds. And one of the first things that was approved under his watch, and it's still not exactly clear how this made it sort of out into the public, was that he put out this advertisement that they wanted to hire a curator specifically for the art museum. And they wrote in the advertisement that they wanted someone who would preserve the museum's traditional white audience, right? That they would set up this museum specifically for the sort of traditional white arts audience. I mean, they said this like specifically in the advertisement, which seems nuts in 2021, but that's what they did. And you can imagine that there was a pretty big backlash against that, and there's still ongoing fallout. That the guy who approved that lost his job. He had been on the job for like a month, and they got rid of him, and it led to this debate. Yes, you have this art museum, you're cultivating an audience for it. It's perhaps overwhelmingly white people. Indianapolis, pretty overwhelmingly white city. But is it appropriate to say that you want like a curator that like curates specifically for like this like one racial sort of demographic? Like that was really kind of crazy to read, and you just kind of wonder about the process that leads to something like that getting put out there, in front of the public. But it does, I think, speak to exactly what you were just saying about like people know who their audiences are. Like the directors, the curators, they have a pretty good notion of who their audiences are, and whether consciously or not, they're going to design to maximize, their audience. They're going to try and show that audience, what it is that they want to see, because it's a question of survival, right? Like if you're, not the Henry Ford, you depend on gate revenue. You depend on foot traffic. Like you've got to have people in the doors, which is why so many museums are suffering so badly right now. Because people are not going, or they're closed, or what have you. So I definitely think that is true, and I think a lot of it even is just subconscious, that knowingly or unknowingly, that they're trying to design museums in ways that reflect what that clientele wants to see. And that, I think, definitely leads to some examples of distortion. But
well,
yeah, I'm sorry. I recommend reading up on the whole thing that happened in Indianapolis, because that was crazy.
yeah, we have talked about how, as opposed to historical markers, monuments, and memorials, museums all have a financial concern. And some are operated more as cultural entities, and some are operated more as businesses. And a lot of that comes down to which groups are in control, whether it's a board of directors, or if it's owned by a particular entity, or if it's a standalone. That impacts a lot of those decisions.
Yeah, for sure. It's like having universities have trustees, right? And before I was at UAH, I did my PhD at Auburn, right? And UAH, I don't know if any of you guys are student athletes, It's great if you are, but Auburn's kind of on a different level when it comes to that, and a lot of decisions sort of get made that are, you know, beneficial to athletics and not necessarily great decisions from an academic standpoint. And having those trustees is a big driver of that, because trustees at Auburn especially care very, very much about athletics, right? Same thing is true in Tuscaloosa, right? So you have different stakeholders in your institution. They all want different things, and inevitably you're going to get some influence from, you know, all these different stakeholders. And the higher up the chain they are, obviously the more positioned they are to influence the decisions that get made, right? But, you know, museums, I'm on the board of the Society of Automotive Historians. I'm a director, right? And, you know, there are things that I agree with my fellow directors about. There are things that I don't agree with them about, right? It just comes down to like, what's your sort of, you know, preference. And, you know, that's just a reality of working in any big institution or small institution, really.
Well, are there any other questions about transportation museums, or how transportation has played a role in many of the ways that elements of the civil rights movement has been memorialized and preserved? All right, then thank you, Dr. Moore, for a very interesting presentation, especially since here in Alabama, we have a few different museums that do focus on transportation, as well as like the Rosa Parks Museum that has the replica bus. In fact, the presentation we had on Monday, most of it was delivered right in front of that bus. So it's interesting to think about from a different perspective some of the things that we've already been talking about in this class. So yeah, we greatly appreciate your time and what you had to talk about.
Sure.
Now
Yeah.
I'll stick around in case anybody else has any other questions, but if not, I will see all of you on Monday when we actually have a tour guide from Montgomery who's going to talk about a variety of museums, monuments, and memorials, including the EJI memorial, as well as the Legacy Museum. So I'll stick around if anybody has any questions, but if not, thank you, Dr. Moore, and I will see you all next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. It was fun.